Ancient cities stand today upon hidden forests buried deep in the mud. Their survival is a paradox that defies everything we know about wood and water. By the end of this, you will understand the five-part formula that allowed these wooden bones to endure for thousands of years. We will uncover how entire ports built on swampy pilings outlasted empires, and why some of their timbers are now harder than stone. What forgotten wisdom did these builders possess that we are only just rediscovering? Venice is sinking, its foundations slowly succumbing to the relentless pressure of its own lagoon. Yet across the Mediterranean and beyond, far older ports built on the same principle of wooden pilings remain stubbornly, almost defiantly, in place. This is the heart of our mystery. Wood is organic. It is food for fungi, a banquet for bacteria. Give it oxygen and water, the very conditions present in every harbor and riverbed, and nature's cleanup crew gets to work, turning solid timber into soft, crumbling rot within a matter of decades. Yet here we have oak, pine, and elm posts that have held up entire cities for millennia. They have supported the weight of granite temples, bustling marketplaces, and generations of human life while submerged in the exact environment that should have destroyed them in a few short centuries. So what changed the rules? The natural law of decay was not suspended. Instead, these ancient builders discovered a loophole. They mastered a set of conditions so perfectly hostile to decay that it transformed a temporary support into a permanent foundation. The search for that missing factor, that perfect preservation scenario, is where archaeology meets a deep, almost intuitive understanding of the hidden world beneath the waterline. It begins not with the wood itself, but with the environment these builders so cleverly manipulated. The secret lies not in the harbor, but beneath it, in the mud itself. Long before the first stones of Venice were laid, Roman engineers were already solving this puzzle in a forgotten corner of their empire. On the island of Sardinia, the ancient port of Olbia was not built on solid ground, but on a swampy lagoon, a mirror of the challenges Venice would face over 1,000 years later. To create a stable base in that soft, waterlogged earth, they employed a method that seems almost brute force in its simplicity. They drove thousands upon thousands of wooden piles, made of sturdy oak and resilient pine, deep into the saturated soil. On top of this submerged forest, they constructed their docks, their warehouses, and the very bones of their thriving port city. For centuries, Olbia was a critical node in Rome's Mediterranean trade network, all supported by what should have been a temporary, rotting foundation. Then the city faded from memory, and its wooden skeleton was silently entombed. That is, until modern construction in Olbia's city center unearthed something astonishing. Workers cutting into the earth found not just a few fragments, but a dense grid of wooden posts perfectly intact. These were not petrified, not turned to stone, but were recognizably wood, still solid after more than 2,000 years. Dendrochronology, the science of reading tree rings like pages in a history book, dated these timbers to the 2nd century before the Common Era. This presented archaeologists with a beautiful contradiction. How could organic material survive for 22 centuries in perpetually wet soil, the very condition we associate with rot and decay? The answer is a concept called anoxic preservation, and it is the first critical piece of our formula. When those Roman piles were hammered deep into the lagoon bed, they were plunged into a world without air. The sediments there are water saturated, meaning every tiny space between the grains of mud is filled with water, leaving no room for oxygen. The microbes and fungi that feast on wood and cause it to decompose are aerobic. They need oxygen to live. In that deep, dark, oxygen-poor tomb, those destructive organisms simply cannot survive. The wood enters a state of suspended animation, a natural time capsule. It is not magically strengthened, it is simply removed from the conditions that cause it to break down. Olbia proves this was not accidental luck, but understood principle. Roman harbor engineering was a refined science, and their mastery of this hidden, anaerobic world beneath the mud set the stage for projects of even greater ambition and scale. But an oxygen-free tomb is only the first part of the preservation formula. To see the next piece, we must travel from the warm Mediterranean to the cold, mist-shrouded fjords of the Viking Age. Here, on the narrow neck of land connecting the Baltic and North Seas, the Norse built Hedeby, a trading powerhouse of staggering scale. Imagine the scene not with quiet mud, but with constant, bustling life. The shallow bay was a forest of masts, with sleek longships and broad-bellied cargo vessels from across the known world jostling for space at elaborate wooden piers. Every shout of a trader, every clink of silver weighed on a scale, every crate of furs or amber being unloaded, all of that vibrant, chaotic energy was transmitted downward through planked walkways and into the very ground beneath the water. And that ground was not solid at all. It was a meticulously engineered labyrinth of wood. The builders of Hedeby faced a shoreline of soft, unstable sediment, a place where heavy structures would simply sink or slide. Their solution was a masterclass in pragmatic engineering. They drove thousands of wooden piles, vertical posts made from alder and oak, deep into the bay's bottom. But they didn't stop there. Between these posts, they constructed horizontal log grids, crisscrossing layers of timber that created a massive, rigid platform submerged just beneath the waterline. On top of this floating forest, they built their wharves and warehouses. This choice of wood was not random. Archaeological analysis of the remarkably preserved fragments shows the builders intentionally selected tree species known for their natural defenses. Alder, for instance, contains tannins that resist fungal attack, while oak becomes incredibly hard and dense when kept permanently wet. They were not just using wood, they were employing a natural material whose properties they understood intimately. The most ingenious innovation, however, was the bulkhead. To prevent their newly claimed land from washing away, the Hedeby engineers built walls. They drove thick planks side by side into the seabed, creating continuous barriers that boxed in the construction area. Inside these wooden boxes, they could then dump soil, stones, and rubble to create solid, permanent building land that jutted out into the bay. It was land reclamation, Viking style. The tool marks chiseled into these timbers 1,000 years ago by an anonymous carpenter are still visible today, a direct tactile link to the minds that solved this problem. Their work was not about defying nature, but collaborating with it, using material science and sheer cleverness to create a durable foothold in a demanding world. The endurance of Hedeby's wooden bones shows us that the second piece of the formula is intelligent design, the deliberate selection and assembly of materials to work in harmony with a challenging environment. Think of a jar of homemade preserves, sealed tight to keep its contents fresh for months. The mud and silt that swallowed these ancient ports acted in precisely the same way, creating a perfect natural seal. This is the environmental science that is the unsung hero of our story, the critical third piece of the preservation formula. It all comes down to one word, anaerobic, meaning an environment completely devoid of free oxygen. When those wooden piles were driven deep into the waterlogged sediments of a riverbed or harbor floor, something remarkable happened. The fine-grained particles of clay and silt suspended in the water slowly settled around the timber like a microscopic blanket. This layer is incredibly dense. It blocks the diffusion of oxygen from the water above, effectively cutting off the supply to anything buried beneath it. As one geoarchaeologist puts it, it is like placing a lid on the jar, but the process goes even further. Any tiny amount of oxygen initially trapped in those sediments is quickly consumed by other organic matter, bits of decaying plants and microorganisms already present in the mud. This biological activity burns up the last traces of free oxygen, creating a completely anoxic microenvironment. In this sterile, oxygen-free tomb, the fungi and aerobic bacteria that are nature's primary decomposers simply cannot survive. They are locked out. The wood is not just buried, it is pickled by the very chemistry of its surroundings. This is why coarse, sandy soils are far less effective at preservation than thick, impermeable clays. The clay forms a superior seal, a barrier that can last for millennia. So the survival of these foundations was not a defiance of nature's rules, but a brilliant exploitation of a very specific natural loophole. The builders may not have understood the microbiology, but through observation and experience, they learned where to build and how to prepare the ground to encourage this process. They were, in effect, engineering time capsules. This leads us to a fascinating question. If the environment does all the preserving, did the choice of wood itself even matter? The answer reveals a fourth layer of ancient wisdom, where material selection became an act of long-term foresight. Material selection mattered profoundly, and nowhere is this more evident than in the colossal engineering of the Byzantine Empire. Beneath the modern streets of Istanbul, a discovery was made that rewrote the book on ancient harbor construction. During excavations for the city's new subway system at Yenikapi, workers did not just find a few old posts. They broke through into a lost world, the legendary harbor of Theodosius. The scale was almost incomprehensible. Archaeologists uncovered the skeletal remains of over 37 Byzantine shipwrecks, from humble fishing boats to great trading vessels, all resting in the mud where they had sunk centuries before. Surrounding them was a vast, grid-like network of wooden wharves and jetties, all built upon a forest of elm and oak piles. This was not a minor dock, it was the primary maritime lifeline of Constantinople, the nerve center of an empire, handling the grain, silk, and treasures that fueled the greatest city of its age. Its survival, hidden for over a millennium, presented a unique puzzle. The harbor was built at the mouth of the Lycos River, where freshwater met the sea in a dynamic, ever-changing estuary. This was a zone of constant movement where silt and sand were always on the march. For the Byzantine engineers, this presented a formidable challenge. Building a stable foundation in such shifting ground seemed a recipe for disaster, yet their solution turned the environment's greatest threat into its most powerful ally. They drove their elm and oak piles deep, knowing the river would do the rest. The Lycos, carrying sediment from the hills above, acted like a slow, deliberate mason. It did not gradually wear the harbor away, it entombed it. Season after season, year after year, a steady rain of fine silt settled over the wooden structures. Wharves that were actively used one decade could be completely buried and forgotten within a few generations. This rapid sedimentation was the key. It did not just cover the wood, it sealed it with astonishing speed, plunging timbers and shipwrecks alike into that oxygen-free, anaerobic environment we now understand so well. The harbor was not merely preserved, it was snapshotted. The same thick, protective mud that saved the foundation piles also captured the ships and their contents in exquisite detail. Archaeologists found baskets of fruit with seeds still intact, leather sandals, wooden tools, and coils of rope, all looking as if they were lost yesterday. This gives us an unparalleled, almost cinematic view of medieval maritime life, a bustling port frozen in a moment of time. The survival of the harbor of Theodosius reveals a profound truth. These ancient builders possessed a deep, almost intuitive grasp of their local environment. They may not have known the word anaerobic, but they understood process. They recognized that the very force which could bury and destroy a harbor, the relentless sediment of the river, could also be harnessed to protect and perpetuate it. They built with materials chosen for the long term, elm and oak that would hold firm, and then they positioned their masterpiece so that nature itself would become its caretaker, laying down a protective shroud that would last for more than 1,000 years. This moves us from understanding preservation to witnessing transformation, for in some rare and wondrous cases, the wood did not just survive, it underwent a change so complete it became something entirely new. A modern carpenter reaches for pressure-treated lumber, knowing its chemical infusion will guard against rot and insects. 2,000 years ago, a Roman engineer standing on a muddy riverbank made a similar calculation, but his knowledge came not from a factory label, but from generations of hard-won empirical wisdom. He was a masterful dendrologist, a scientist of trees, and his choice of timber was the first, most critical line of defense in the war against decay. Not all wood is created equal, and the builders of these ancient ports understood this on a cellular level. They selected species not for convenience, but for their inherent, almost magical properties of endurance. Take the mighty oak, a favorite across the ancient world. Its secret weapon is tannin, a bitter compound that gives acorns their astringent taste and red wine its structure. In oak heartwood, the dense, non-living core of the tree, tannins act as a powerful natural biocide. They are toxic to the fungi and bacteria that cause decay, creating a built-in preservative system. When permanently submerged, oak undergoes another transformation. Its cellular structure actually tightens, becoming harder and more durable over time, a process known as becoming water-hardened. Then there is alder, widely used in Viking-age ports like Hedeby. Alder is naturally resistant to splitting when constantly wet, a vital trait for a pile being pounded into the seabed and then supporting immense weight. Elm shares this quality, its interlocking grain providing a toughness that resists shock and shear forces. In the sun-drenched Mediterranean, builders sometimes turn to olive wood, an incredibly dense and oily timber that repels water and resists marine borers almost instinctively. But what is happening inside these chosen woods on a microscopic level? Wood scientists point to a feature called heartwood and to specific structures within it. As a tree matures, the inner core of its trunk, the heartwood, ceases to function in transporting water. The tree then infuses this zone with a cocktail of protective compounds, resins, gums, and oils that darken the wood and make it far more resistant to biological attack. More importantly, in species like oak and chestnut, the tree forms tiny, balloon-like plugs called tyloses. These tyloses swell and seal off the internal water-conducting channels, the vessels. This is a brilliant natural adaptation. It prevents fungal spores from traveling through the wood, blocking the pathways decay would use to spread like a network of highways. The ancient builders may not have seen the tyloses, but they knew the result. They knew that the dark, dense heartwood of a mature oak was fundamentally different from the lighter, softer sapwood that surrounded it. This knowledge guided their practice. Archaeologists note that these builders often used roundwood, meaning whole logs with only the bark removed, rather than milling the timber into squared beams. This was a deliberate choice. By keeping the outer ring of sapwood intact, they were preserving the tree's natural cylindrical strength, its ability to distribute stress evenly. Removing the bark eliminated a point of entry for pests, while the intact sapwood, though less durable, acted as a sacrificial outer layer, protecting the precious, defensive heartwood within. So we are left with a reflective question. Was this profound understanding of materials simply the accumulated result of generations of trial and error, watching one type of wood crumble in a decade while another stood firm for a century? Or did these cultures possess a more systematic, almost scientific catalog of arboreal knowledge, passed down from master builders to apprentices? The evidence suggests it was a blend of both deep observation and refined tradition. Their selection was never random. It was a calculated investment in the future, placing the right biological ally into a battle against time, setting the stage for the next phase of their ingenious construction. But what happens when the entire city vanishes? Not just its foundations, but its towering statues, its temples, and its very streets are swallowed by the sea, lost to legend for over 1,000 years. This is the story of Heracleion, known to the Egyptians as Thonis, a place that crossed the line from history into myth. Ancient texts spoke of a glorious gateway to Egypt, a bustling port where all trade from the Greek world had to stop and pay tribute before sailing up the Nile. Then, sometime around the 2nd century before the Common Era, it disappeared. Historians debated if it was ever real at all, until one day in the year 2000, a team of underwater archaeologists led by Frank Gaudio made a sweep across the murky floor of Aboukir Bay. Their sonar pinged back not just anomalies but the clear, geometric outlines of a drowned world. Diving down, they entered a dreamscape frozen in time. Colossal statues of a pharaoh and a queen, each standing over 16 feet tall, lay face down on the seabed as if gently laid to rest. Nearby, the remains of a grand temple to the god Amun-Jereb emerged from the gloom, its stone blocks scattered amidst a forest of smaller, darker shapes, the wooden posts and piles of the city's docks and foundations. Gold coins, bronze ritual vessels, and delicate jewelry lay sprinkled across the site, but perhaps the most telling finds were the humble ones, perfectly intact woven baskets, and even fragile sheets of papyrus, their Greek and Demotic script still legible. This was not a slow decay, it was a snapshot, a moment in time captured with impossible clarity. The key to this miraculous preservation lies in the very catastrophe that destroyed the city. Heracleion was built on the unstable sediments of the Nile Delta, a landscape always in flux. Researchers believe a perfect storm of natural events sealed its fate, a combination of rising sea levels, a gradual sinking of the land, and perhaps a sudden, violent trigger like an earthquake or a massive flood. The ground beneath the city literally liquefied, a process called soil liquefaction, causing entire districts to slide into the Mediterranean in what might have been a single, catastrophic event. As the city sank, the Nile itself provided its shroud. The river, carrying immense loads of sediment, dumped a thick, uniform blanket of clay and fine sand over the ruins. This was not a gentle siltation over centuries, but a rapid, overwhelming burial. That thick layer acted as an instantaneous and nearly perfect anaerobic seal. It smothered the site, driving out oxygen and creating an environment where even the most delicate organic materials like wood and papyrus were protected. The wood used here, likely local acacia or imported cedar for important structures, found itself in an ideal preservation chamber. The deep, calm waters of the bay meant there was little current to erode the covering sediments or physically batter the timbers. The clay seal prevented biological decay, while the stable, deep water prevented mechanical destruction. Heracleion's tragedy became its salvation. The disaster that erased it from the map created the conditions that preserved it for archaeology. This presents us with a profound irony in our search for these ancient wooden bones. Sometimes, the most complete preservation comes not from careful engineering alone, but from a sudden, transformative act of nature, a geological event that turns a living city into a time capsule, gifting us with a clarity of the past that no slow burial could ever provide. The rhythmic thud of a heavy weight, lifted and dropped, was the heartbeat of these ancient construction sites. This was the sound of pile driving, a simple yet monumental act of engineering that transformed unstable ground into a solid base for history. Imagine a team of workers, perhaps using a wooden tripod and a rope pulley system, hoisting a massive stone or iron weight high above a sharpened timber post. On command, they would release it, sending it crashing down onto the head of the pile, driving it inch by inch, foot by foot, deep into the soft sediments of a riverbed or harbor floor. This was not brute force alone, but a carefully controlled operation to ensure each pile went in perfectly vertical and at the correct spacing. Builders used wooden guide frames. These were essentially temporary scaffolds that held the pile in alignment, preventing it from leaning or buckling under the tremendous impact. Precision here was everything, for a crooked pile was a weak pile, compromising the entire grid that would support a wharf or a building above. Once this submerged forest of vertical posts was in place, the real architectural ingenuity began. The challenge was to bridge this grid, to create a stable platform that could distribute the immense weight of stone temples or multi-story warehouses. The solution was a technique known as grillage or cribwork. Builders would take long logs and lay them horizontally across the tops of the piles, not in one direction, but in alternating crosswise layers, like building a giant, sturdy box out of Lincoln logs. This created a rigid, interconnected mat that sat just below the waterline or was buried within the reclaimed land. Often, the cavities inside this wooden box were then packed with stones, rubble, and compacted earth. This fill served a dual purpose. It added immense ballast, locking the structure in place, and it further distributed the load from above over a much wider area of the soft ground below. Think of it as giving a building a pair of snowshoes, preventing it from sinking into the mire. The Romans, masters of standardized engineering, likely used such techniques in their military harbors, where speed and reliability were paramount. Manuals for provincial governors, like those written by Vitruvius, would have detailed these methods, ensuring a fort in Britain and a port in North Africa were built with the same proven principles. But how did they hold this wooden skeleton together? Nails were used, but more commonly, builders relied on the timeless strength of joinery. They carved precise mortise and tenon joints, where a projecting tongue on one timber fits snugly into a carved slot on another, locking them together with the pressure of the surrounding structure. Wooden pegs, called trenails, were driven through drilled holes to pin beams in place. These connections were brilliant in their flexibility. Unlike rigid metal fasteners that can corrode or snap, these wooden joints allowed for a slight, forgiving movement. As the foundation settled over decades, as tides pushed and pulled, the structure could shift minutely without catastrophic failure. This hands-on wisdom, this art of framing and joining, was the physical manifestation of their long-term planning. They were not building for a decade, but for centuries, creating structures designed to settle, to adapt, and to find a lasting equilibrium with the demanding world beneath them. The philosophy of building with water reached its most intimate form not in grand imperial ports, but in the quiet, waterlogged marshes of the pre-medieval Netherlands. Here, survival itself was an act of foundational engineering. For the Frisian people, the greatest threat was not a sinking city, but the North Sea itself, whose storm surges could sweep across the flat, low-lying landscape without warning. Their response was not to construct harbors out into the water, but to lift their entire world above it. They built Turpen and Weirden, artificial dwelling mounds that rose from the marshes like islands of human ingenuity. These were not ports in the traditional, monumental sense, but they were the essential predecessors, the stable bases from which all local life and trade could emanate. The process was communal and cyclical. A family or small group would select a slightly raised spot in the salt marsh and begin the slow, deliberate work of raising the earth. They used what they had in abundance, layering sod cut from the rich peat, household waste, animal dung, and clay dug from nearby channels. Season after season, generation after generation, the mound grew, creating a habitable plateau safe from all but the very worst floods. But to build on such soft, saturated ground, they needed a clever starting point. Before the first layers of earth were placed, they laid down a foundation of brushwood and logs. This was not the rigid grid of vertical piles seen in Roman harbors, but something more flexible and organic, designed for a different kind of challenge. The true brilliance was in their use of fascine work. Workers would gather bundles of brushwood, often willow or alder branches, and tie them together into long, flexible rolls. These fascines were then laid down side by side and sometimes in crosswise layers over the marsh, creating a vast, spongy mat. This mat served several critical functions. First, it distributed the weight of the growing mound over a wider area, preventing it from immediately sinking into the mire. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it acted as a drainage layer. The fascine mat, filled with countless tiny air pockets, allowed water from the soggy mound to slowly percolate down and escape, while also wicking moisture away from the living areas above. It was a primitive yet highly effective geotextile, a technology born of pure necessity. Expert analysis of these mounds reveals an unexpected archaeological bounty. The consistent dampness within the turpen, maintained by the water table just below, created another perfect anaerobic environment. Organic materials that would vanish in a typical settlement are preserved here in stunning detail. Wooden tools, leather shoes, woven textiles, and even food remains have been found in remarkable condition, giving us an incredibly vivid picture of daily life. The foundation did not just support the homes, it preserved the story of the people who lived in them. This leads us to a reflective question about human adaptation. The Frisian approach represents a fundamentally different philosophy from the imperial engineers of Rome or Byzantium. Theirs was not about imposing a grand, static design upon the water, but about a dynamic, communal coexistence with it. They did not fight the marsh, they integrated with it, using its own materials to build a resilient, elevated refuge. The turpen were never finished, they were continually maintained and expanded by the community, a project without end. This adaptive, incremental, and deeply local approach to foundation building was not about legacy in stone, but about persistence in the face of relentless change. It proves that the dialogue between humanity and water has many languages, each with its own grammar of survival. That wooden post pulled from the mud feels more like concrete than timber. This is not an illusion, but a profound transformation happening at a microscopic level, where chemistry itself becomes the final, enduring guardian. Within the dark, waterlogged tomb of an ancient harbor, a silent alchemy takes place, one that gradually turns organic wood into a mineral replica of itself. It begins with a common component of seawater and groundwater, the sulfate ion. In these oxygen-deprived environments, specialized bacteria survive not on oxygen, but on sulfate, converting it into hydrogen sulfide, a compound with that familiar rotten egg smell. This gas then permeates the waterlogged wood. Now introduce iron. This could come from the groundwater itself, from minerals in the surrounding soil, or even from the rusting iron nails and tools used in the original construction. The hydrogen sulfide reacts with iron ions, forming microscopic crystals of iron sulfide, most commonly a mineral called pyrite or fool's gold. These crystals don't just coat the wood, they infiltrate it. They form inside the very cell walls and hollow vessels of the timber, a process so gradual and complete it is called pseudomorphic replacement. Over centuries, the organic material of the wood is slowly, molecule by molecule, substituted with these stone-like minerals. The wood retains its shape, its grain, even the tool marks from the carpenter's adze, but its substance has fundamentally changed. As one conservation scientist describes it, you are left with a perfect mineral cast of a piece of wood. This is why some recovered timbers ring with a hollow, ceramic sound when tapped and are impossibly heavy to lift. The wood has, in a very real sense, turned to stone while preserving its original form. This creates a fascinating paradox for modern archaeologists. While this mineralization is the ultimate preservation, it also presents a grave danger the moment the wood leaves its anaerobic sanctuary. When iron sulfide minerals are exposed to oxygen from the air, they can react to form sulfuric acid. This acid then attacks the remaining organic material in the wood, causing it to crumble into dust at an alarming rate. A timber that survived 2,000 years in the mud can disintegrate in a matter of months if not immediately and meticulously conserved. This invisible chemical armor, forged by the slow dance of bacteria and minerals, was the ancient foundation's final, fortuitous layer of defense. It was a happy accident of environment, a natural process that locked these wooden skeletons into a state of permanent stasis, ensuring they would outlast not just the cities they supported, but the very empires that built them. The River Thames has always been a living artery, not a static boundary. For nearly 2 millennia, its banks have been a stage for a continuous, unspoken collaboration between human ambition and a unique tidal environment. Long before the stone towers of modern London rose skyward, the city's first great port was built not on stone, but on a resilient lattice of timber that grew with the settlement itself. This was Llandenwick, the Saxon trading port, and before it Roman Londinium, both drawing their lifeblood from the same river and both solving the same foundational puzzle. Their solution created not just a dock but a deep, stratified archive of wood, a physical chronicle of urban perseverance. Picture the scene along that ancient foreshore. The Thames is tidal here, its water level rising and falling dramatically twice each day. Ships from across the empire and later from across the North Sea would wait for the high tide to navigate the river, then tie up at wooden wharves that jutted out into the murky flow. On those platforms, a cacophony of commerce unfolded. Casks of wine from Gaul, pottery from distant kilns, and exotic spices were unloaded by workers whose boots trod not on solid earth, but on a sophisticated wooden carpet laid over the river's soft, muddy edge. The engineering was both robust and elegant. To hold back the unstable riverbank and create stable ground, builders constructed massive revetments. These were essentially retaining walls made from vertical oak piles driven deep into the foreshore. Between these piles, they fitted horizontal planks, creating a solid, box-like barrier that held the land in place. Behind this wall, they dumped tons of rubble, soil, and refuse, reclaiming new land from the Thames itself. This new waterfront property became the platform for warehouses, workshops, and homes, all resting on a hidden wooden skeleton. But the true secret to this system's longevity was not its initial construction, but its relentless, ongoing maintenance. The port was not a one-time project finished by a Roman engineer and left untouched. It was a living, breathing infrastructure. Timber decays, storms damage, and the river's currents are relentless. So, generation after generation, century after century, the people of London repaired, reinforced, and rebuilt. When a section of oak planking became too worn, they did not tear out the old foundation. They simply built a new revetment wall further out into the river, in front of the old one, or laid a new timber floor directly over the decaying layer below. This practice of continuous repair and overlay created an extraordinary archaeological record. Excavations at sites like the Temple of Mithras reveal not a single layer of Roman timber, but a layer cake of wooden history. You can see the crisp, square-cut marks of a Roman carpenter's tool on an oak pile. Directly above it, separated by a layer of dark, silty mud, are the slightly different joints of a Saxon repair. And above that, perhaps the rounded posts of a medieval jetty. Each layer represents a chapter in the city's story, each generation literally building upon the preserved remains of the last. This was possible only because of the Thames' unique tidal environment. The constant cycle of saturation and exposure, combined with the deposition of fine, silty mud, created a perfect anaerobic trap. As each generation's timberwork was replaced or buried by the next, it was quickly enveloped by that oxygen-poor mud, entering a state of suspended decay. The river did not wash these wooden bones away. It meticulously filed them away in a natural vault. So, London's enduring wooden heart teaches us a profound lesson about preservation. Sometimes it is not a single act of brilliant engineering that saves the past, but the simple, persistent act of urban life continuing in one place. The very need to maintain the city's vital connection to the water ensured that each era's foundations were carefully entombed by the next, creating a cumulative archive that no single civilization could have built alone. The city's continuity became the ultimate preservation strategy, safeguarding a tangible memory of itself within its own muddy, timeless bed. The most enduring preservative was sometimes not human intention but planetary change. We must widen our lens from the carpenter's yard to the scale of shifting coastlines and altering climates, forces that could act as accidental preservationists. This introduces the idea of a preservation window, a specific set of environmental conditions that, often created by change itself, locks organic materials into a state of suspended animation. For a port city, the very events that spelled its economic doom or physical abandonment could be the same ones that guaranteed the survival of its wooden foundations. A rapid rise in relative sea level, whether from the land sinking or the ocean rising, could submerge and bury a waterfront district with startling speed. This was not a gentle, centuries-long siltation, but a geologically swift event. The harbor floor becomes a seabed, and a thick, uniform blanket of sediment drops from the water column, creating an instantaneous anaerobic seal. Similarly, the slow, relentless subsidence of some coastlines, or the opposite effect of post-glacial rebound in regions once weighed down by ice sheets, subtly altered local water tables and sedimentation patterns. These shifts changed the rules of decay on a regional scale, often in ways that benefited wood survival. Paleoclimatologists note fascinating correlations. Periods of significant port decline or transformation, such as during the late Antique Little Ice Age, a phase of cooler temperatures and climatic instability from around the 6th to the 7th centuries, align with broader environmental stress. Changing weather patterns could disrupt trade routes, alter river flows that kept harbors clear, or increase the frequency of devastating storms. A city might be abandoned, its wooden wharves left to the elements. But if that abandonment coincided with a rising water table or increased sedimentation from eroded uplands, the result was not decay but a perfect burial. The wood was forgotten by people but protected by the very processes that made the site untenable. There is a profound irony here that reframes our entire understanding. The siltation that choked a harbor and killed its commerce, the flood that inundated its streets, or the seismic jolt that caused its land to liquefy and sink, these were not merely destructive endings. For the wooden bones of the city, these catastrophes were the beginning of an unimaginably long slumber. They were the event that closed the lid on the jar, that plunged the structure into the dark, oxygen-free sanctuary where time stands still. So the survival of these ancient ports is revealed as a complex partnership. It is a dialogue between human craft, the deliberate choice of materials and ingenious engineering, and vast, impersonal planetary processes. The builders provided the durable artifact, the wood chosen and assembled with foresight. Climate and geology then provided the perfect vault, often through the very changes that rendered the human achievement obsolete. This partnership asks us to see these sites not as ruins, but as legacies in suspension, gifts from the past made possible by the restless earth itself. Venice did not invent its watery world, it inherited it. The blueprint for building a civilization upon the shifting waters of the northern Adriatic was perfected centuries earlier in the forgotten lagoon laboratories of Ravenna and Aquileia. These were not just ports, but entire cities engineered to float upon a geological paradox. The ground here is a treacherous layer cake. On top lies soft, recent sediment, but beneath it is a unique, compressible clay layer known as Caranto. This substratum behaves like a dense sponge, firm when undisturbed but prone to shifting and settling under heavy, concentrated weight. To build anything monumental here, from a humble warehouse to an imperial basilica, Roman and Byzantine engineers had to devise a way to bypass this instability entirely. Their solution was to create an artificial bedrock, a forest of their own making. They drove long, sharply pointed wooden piles, not just a few feet, but often 30 or 40 feet deep, through the soft upper layers and the tricky caranto, until their tips finally bit into the more stable, sandy strata far below. Each major structure rested not on a few dozen of these piles, but on hundreds, even thousands, forming a submerged grid that distributed the immense weight of stone and brick over a vast area of the unstable ground. It was a foundational principle of load distribution, executed on a staggering scale. The choice of timber for this critical task was a deliberate import. Builders favored larch and stone pine, species not necessarily abundant in the immediate lagoon but sought out for their exceptional properties. The heartwood of these trees is rich in natural resins, creating a built-in resistance to the relentless moisture and the boring creatures of the brackish water. This was a long-term investment, using materials known to perform for generations. You can stand today in the shimmering, mosaic-filled silence of the Basilica of San Vitale in Ravenna, a masterpiece of 6th century Byzantine architecture, and feel the solid marble floor beneath your feet. That sensation of permanence is an illusion crafted by wood. Every ounce of that magnificent structure, its soaring dome and walls glittering with gold, is borne aloft by its original forest of wooden piles, still sound after 1400 years. They are hidden, but they are there, a silent testament to the precision of the original engineering. Ravenna and Aquileia were more than cities. They were vast, open-air workshops for a new science of foundation. Their networks of canals, fortified islands, and wooden embankments were continuous experiments in hydraulic management. Each new church, each new palace, added to a growing body of knowledge about how to partner with the lagoon. This accumulated wisdom, passed from master carpenter to apprentice, from one generation of engineers to the next, was a living library of techniques. The reflective question this raises is profound. How did this deeply regional, hands-on knowledge travel and evolve? The artisans who understood the caranto and the virtues of larch did not vanish. Their expertise, refined over centuries in these earlier centers, became the indispensable intellectual capital for an even more audacious venture. The fledgling settlements on the islands of the Venetian lagoon were not starting from scratch. They were building upon a legacy of solved problems, ready to apply the hard-won lessons of Ravenna and Aquileia to an even more challenging canvas, where the ultimate laboratory would become a republic. The thud of a modern excavator's bucket can be the sound of a time capsule cracking open. In cities like London, Istanbul, or Rome, the relentless push for new subway tunnels and skyscraper foundations has become an unexpected form of archaeological survey. A construction crew digging deep for pilings suddenly stops. Their machinery has struck not rock, but a dense, dark mat of perfectly preserved timber. A grid of ancient posts emerging from the mud exactly as the builders left them 2,000 years ago. It is a moment of electrifying discovery and an instant crisis. For the first time in millennia, air touches these waterlogged woods. The very oxygen they were so perfectly sealed from now becomes their most immediate enemy. The race against time begins not in centuries but in minutes. As the wood dries, the water that has filled its cellular structure for ages evaporates. The cells collapse, causing the timber to shrink dramatically, warp, and split apart with a series of audible cracks. A beam that survived the rise and fall of empires can reduce itself to a pile of splinters in a matter of days if left untreated. But the chemical threat is even more insidious. Remember the iron sulfide minerals that turned wood to stone. Upon exposure to oxygen, These minerals can catalyze the formation of acids that attack the remaining organic material from within. Conservators describe watching a seemingly solid timber slowly crumble into a fine, dark powder, a process called rapid post-excavation decay. The paradox is heartbreaking. Our very act of finding these ancient foundations threatens to erase them forever. This has forced archaeology to develop a whole new discipline of rescue and stabilization. One of the most common methods is a years-long chemical bath. Recovered timbers are submerged in tanks filled with a wax-like substance called polyethylene glycol, or PEG. This water-soluble polymer slowly soaks into the wood, replacing the water in the cells and providing a supportive scaffold that prevents collapse when the artifact finally dries. The process is incredibly slow and expensive, sometimes taking over a decade for a single large ship's timber. Another cutting-edge technique is freeze drying. The waterlogged wood is first treated with PEG, then frozen and placed in a vacuum chamber. The ice sublimates, turning directly from a solid to a gas, leaving the stabilized wood structure intact without the destructive forces of liquid evaporation. These are monumental efforts requiring vast resources and patience, underscoring that preservation is no longer a passive gift of the environment, but an active, urgent science. This ethical dilemma has led to a revolutionary shift in strategy. Why excavate at all if it triggers destruction? Today, archaeologists increasingly turn to non-invasive eyes. Ground-penetrating radar sends pulses into the earth, mapping buried structures by the echoes they return, revealing entire harbor layouts without breaking ground. Dendrochronologists can now extract tiny core samples from in-situ piles, reading their tree ring patterns to date the construction to the exact year, sometimes even the season, before sealing the wood back in its protective muddy tomb. The goal is no longer simply to retrieve, but to understand in place. This modern drama connects us directly to the legacy of those ancient builders. Their ingenuity gave us the gift of these wooden time capsules. Our responsibility is to develop the wisdom to study them without squandering that gift. Every new discovery is now a balancing act, a race to document a marvel before the air we breathe claims it, reminding us that the dialogue with the past is a conversation we must handle with the utmost care. Motya was an island fortress, a deliberate statement of power carved from the landscape. This Phoenician stronghold off Sicily's coast wasn't just a port, it was a completely engineered maritime machine, and its heart was a geometric marvel known as a Chthon. Unlike a natural harbor or a simple wooden jetty, the Chthon was an artificial, rectangular basin dug directly into the island's shore. Imagine a giant, perfect swimming pool carved from the earth, then flooded with seawater from a narrow channel. Its straight sides were not left as raw earth, they were meticulously clad in timber. Wooden quays and revetments lined the entire inner perimeter, creating a stable, organized waterfront where ships could be loaded, repaired, and sheltered from the open sea. A massive seawall further protected the entrance, turning the Chthon into a locked box, a secure naval yard that reflected the Phoenicians' mastery of controlled maritime space. This was harbor building as an act of sheer will, transforming a shallow lagoon into a strategic asset. The timber here served a specific, aggressive purpose. It wasn't just supporting weight from above, it was actively holding back the earth from collapsing into the excavated basin. Frameworks of wooden piles and planks acted as retaining walls, battling constant lateral pressure to maintain that perfect geometric form. The Phoenicians, legendary seafarers from the Levant, almost certainly brought this concept with them, a portable technology of dominion adapted to a new island home. But the local environment of Motya's lagoon added its own unexpected layers of preservation. The waters here are hypersaline, much saltier than the open sea. This briny chemistry creates a harsh environment, one that may have inhibited certain wood-degrading fungi and bacteria that thrive in fresher waters. More visibly, a remarkable symbiotic process took hold on the submerged timber. Marine mollusks, particularly a type of clam, colonized the wooden surfaces. Over generations, these creatures lived and died, their shells accumulating into a thick, hard crust that completely encased the wood. This wasn't a soft layer of silt, but a literal shell concrete, a rigid, mineralized armor that physically shielded the timber from abrasion, borers, and oxygenated water. The wood inside this stony cocoon was then preserved by the now familiar anaerobic conditions within the compacted shell matrix. So at Motya, we see a brilliant convergence of human intention and natural process. The Phoenicians designed a harbor with wooden bones for control and utility. In response, the unique chemistry and biology of the lagoon provided a form of natural reinforcement, collaborating with the builders to petrify their work. This site moves our understanding forward, from foundations that merely survive to structures that actively shape and define the maritime landscape, showing how wood could be used not just to build on water, but to sculpt it into a tool of empire. A single wooden pile is the unseen root of a great cultural tree. While emperors and merchants took center stage in the historical record, their ambitions were literally grounded in these humble, waterlogged timbers. The mastery of building durable ports in impossible places was not merely a construction feat, it was a foundational technology that enabled everything else. It was the critical infrastructure that turned geography from a barrier into a bridge, allowing food, ideas, and power to flow across continents. Consider the sheer physical challenge of supplying a metropolis like ancient Rome, a city of over 1 million inhabitants. Its survival depended on a constant, massive influx of grain from North Africa and Egypt. This was the Annona, the state-sponsored grain supply, a logistical operation of staggering complexity. It required not just ships, but places for those ships to reliably and swiftly unload their precious cargo. A single broken wharf or a collapsed dock in the portus of Rome could create a bottleneck that threatened the city with hunger and unrest. The standardized, resilient wooden foundations of imperial harbors, from Ostia to Alexandria, provided that reliability. They created predictable nodes in a vast network, allowing the empire to function as a single economic unit. Durable wharves meant faster turnaround for ships, which meant more grain, olive oil, and wine could move from province to capital, fueling the urban engine that was Rome itself. This principle scaled across time and culture. Centuries later, the commercial powerhouse of the Hanseatic League, a network of merchant guilds across northern Europe, relied on a chain of nearly identical port facilities. From Lübeck to Bergen, these trading posts featured the same familiar architecture, timber wharves and warehouses built on pilings. This standardization was a language of efficiency. A merchant from Bremen arriving in Tallinn knew exactly how his cog would be moored and his goods unloaded, because the foundational technology was the same. It reduced friction, cost, and risk, enabling the dense web of trade in wool, timber, and amber that defined the region for centuries. The longevity of the wooden works directly supported the longevity of these political and economic systems. They were silent, steadfast partners in history, bearing the weight of commerce season after season, decade after decade. Without this hidden technology, the cohesion of any far-flung empire or trade league would have been far more fragile. How could you administer a province or enforce a trade treaty if you could not reliably land the ships carrying your officials, your soldiers, or your silver? The stable port was the prerequisite for stable rule. The implications extended far beyond bulk commodities. These same docks welcomed the ships carrying luxury goods, silk from China, spices from India, and papyrus from Egypt. But they also carried intangible cargo. In the holds of those vessels were artisans, scholars, and religious texts. A durable port was a permanent gateway, a point of continuous cultural exchange. The ideas that shaped the medieval world, from new architectural styles to religious movements, often arrived first on a wooden quay. The foundation that supported a crate of Syrian glass also supported the spread of a philosophy. So when we look at these waterlogged timbers today, we are not just looking at clever engineering, we are looking at the physical enablers of history. They provided the stage upon which the drama of empire, the bustle of the market, and the quiet exchange of knowledge could unfold. Their survival is a testament not just to ancient craft, but to the profound truth that the deepest foundations of civilization are often the ones we never see. The colorful facades of Bergen's Bergen are a postcard from the Middle Ages, but the real story is written in the mud beneath them. This UNESCO World Heritage Site, a row of iconic wooden merchant houses, has been consumed by fire at least 7 times in its long history. Each time, the flames devoured the superstructure, the gabled roofs and painted planks that make it so recognizable. Yet when the smoke cleared, the community did not start from scratch. They returned to the same narrow plots, the same alignment along the water, and rebuilt upon the same ancient, waterlogged foundation. This is not a story of destruction, but of profound persistence, where social memory and material wisdom became a single, unbroken thread. The continuity of Bergen across 8 centuries of fire and renewal reveals a powerful truth. The most resilient element of a city is not its bricks and mortar, but its ingrained understanding of place. The original layout, established by German Hanseatic merchants in the 12th century, was a masterpiece of efficient communal design. Long, narrow plots ran perpendicular from the wharf with a shared alleyway behind. Each plot housed a trading complex with warehouses on the ground floor facing the water and living quarters above. This arrangement maximized access to the docks and fostered a tight-knit commercial community. When fire inevitably struck, this social and spatial blueprint was the first thing saved, not on parchment, but in the collective mind of the merchants. Rebuilding codes agreed upon by the community dictated that new construction had to conform to the old plot lines and architectural style. This was not nostalgia, it was pragmatic genius. It ensured the harbor's functional efficiency was preserved and that disputes were minimized. The community acted as its own living archive, using tradition as a tool for rapid recovery. But this social continuity would have been meaningless without a physical base that could survive the inferno. That base was hidden in the soft, saturated soils of the Vagan bayfront. Here, builders faced a familiar, intractable problem: ground too unstable to support heavy timber buildings. Their solution was the log raft foundation, a technique of elegant simplicity. They did not drive piles. Instead, they laid down a dense grid of untreated pine logs, crisscrossed in layers, directly on the wet mud. This created a vast floating mat, a wooden carpet that distributed the weight of the buildings evenly over a wide area. Think of it as placing a heavy book on a soft pillow. The pillow flattens and spreads the load, preventing the book from sinking. The log raft acted as that pillow, floating on the water-saturated soils, rising and falling slightly with the water table. This foundation did not burn because it was perpetually soaked, lying below the waterline in the earth. When fire razed the buildings above, the raft remained intact, a ghostly outline of the city waiting in the dark earth. Archaeologists excavating beneath Bergen have found these log grids perfectly preserved, the wood darkened but solid, still performing its duty after hundreds of years. The pine, constantly waterlogged, had entered that familiar state of anaerobic preservation, protected by the very environment it was designed to conquer. So Bergen stands as a dialogue between fire and water, between the ephemeral and the eternal. The wooden buildings above were always temporary, destined to meet flame. The foundation below and the social agreements that governed it were designed for permanence. Each rebirth of the wharf was a reaffirmation of a compact between community and landscape, a promise to remember how to build in this specific place, with this specific mud, against this specific set of dangers. It is a living tradition, not frozen in time but continually renewed, proving that resilience is sometimes a cycle of loss and return, built upon a foundation that never forgets. Stone symbolized eternity, the unyielding material of gods and emperors. Yet when ancient engineers faced the soft, whispering uncertainty of a riverbank or a tidal flat, they often turned away from that prestige and chose the humble, living material of the forest. This was not a compromise but a calculated technological decision. For foundations in unstable, waterlogged ground, wood possessed a set of advantages that stone simply could not match. The first and perhaps most critical was flexibility. A stone foundation is rigid. When the ground beneath it settles unevenly, a common occurrence in soft sediments, the stone cannot bend. It can only crack, leading to catastrophic failure for the structure it supports. Wood, however, has a natural give. A grid of wooden piles can shift and settle as a unit, absorbing differential movement without fracturing. This same flexibility allowed wooden foundations to withstand seismic shocks, a vital consideration in regions prone to tremors. The entire structure could sway and settle back into place where stone would have shattered. Ease of construction was another decisive factor. Transporting massive stone blocks required immense labor, specialized sledges, and prepared roads. In contrast, timber could be floated directly to a construction site along the very river or coastline where it was needed. Working wood was also far quicker and required less specialized tooling than dressing stone. A team could sharpen and drive dozens of piles in the time it took to quarry and shape a single foundation stone. This efficiency translated directly into cost, making large-scale harbor projects feasible for growing cities without the treasury of an empire. Then, of course, there was the potential for preservation we have traced throughout this story. In the right anaerobic environment, wood could endure for millennia, often outlasting the very civilizations that drove it into the mud. Stone, while durable, was not immune to the aqueous world. In constant water, especially salt water, stone could erode, dissolve, or be undermined by currents that left it tilting into the deep. A stone foundation placed on soft ground without a stable base would simply sink, a slow and irreversible descent. We can see this philosophical divide in two iconic structures. The Parthenon in Athens sits squarely on the limestone bedrock of the Acropolis. Its stone foundations are an extension of the living rock, a marriage of monument and mountain suited to a high, dry, and stable site. Now consider a Roman pons, a bridge across the Tiber. The majestic stone arches we see today often rest upon hidden feet of wood. Roman engineers would first drive clusters of wooden piles into the riverbed to create stable piers in the soft sediment. Only upon this resilient wooden platform would they then begin to lay their stonework. The stone provided the grandeur and the load-bearing arch, but the wood provided the essential stability in an impossible environment. This comparison invites a reflective question that challenges our modern assumptions. We often equate stone with permanence and wood with the temporary. Yet in the demanding context of maritime engineering, that hierarchy flips. The smarter, more durable long-term investment for a port city was often the forest, not the quarry. Choosing wood was not a sign of primitive technology, but of sophisticated environmental intelligence. It represents a nuanced understanding that true permanence is not about the hardest material, but about the most harmonious partnership with the landscape. This reframes our view of ancient innovation, revealing a technological hierarchy where adaptability and foresight were valued just as highly as monumental grandeur. Morning mist still clings to the surface of an alpine lake, a silent gray blanket. Then, as the light shifts, a pattern emerges from the depths, not natural stones, but the ghostly lines and grids of a submerged village, a community built not on the shore, but upon the water itself. These are the prehistoric pile dwellings, a network of settlements scattered around lakes like Zurich and Constance, and they redefine what we mean by an ancient port. They were not trading empires but homes. Their harbors were their front doors, and their wooden foundations were the very ground upon which daily Neolithic life unfolded over 6,000 years ago. This pushes our timeline back into a breathtaking scale of deep time. While the Romans were mastering their harbors, these Alpine communities had already been living on wooden platforms for millennia. Their preservation is a gift of the cold, deep lake muds, anoxic environments that have saved a snapshot of prehistoric life with almost impossible clarity. Archaeologists here find not just the expected wooden posts, but the fragile fabric of existence itself. Intact woven baskets still hold hazelnuts, textiles, ropes, and even bread loaves have been recovered, looking as if they were left out to dry yesterday. This is because the constant cold and the perfect, oxygen-free seal of the fine lake sediments slow bacterial activity to a near standstill. It is a natural refrigeration on a millennial scale, preserving organic materials that vanish almost everywhere else on Earth. The choice of wood for these ancient platforms speaks to a deep, localized knowledge. Paleobotanical studies which analyze ancient plant remains show these builders were selective foresters. They favored oak for its strength and durability, ash for its straight, resilient grain, and beech for its workability. They understood which trees would best resist the constant moisture and bear the weight of their homes and families. These villages were built for two intertwined reasons: defense and resource access. Living over the water provided a natural barrier against predators and rival groups. But more importantly, it placed the community at the heart of its world. From their doorsteps, they could fish in deep waters, harvest reeds for thatch and weaving, and easily launch canoes to reach hunting grounds or neighboring villages. The wooden foundation was not an engineering challenge to be overcome for commerce, but the foundational solution for existence. It represents the primordial application of the principle we have traced through grand ports and imperial cities. Here, at its origin, the drive to build on water was not about empire or trade, but about the basic, profound human instinct to find a safe place, to access life-giving resources, and to create a stable community in a challenging landscape. In the quiet of these alpine lakes, we see the humble, essential beginning of a dialogue with water that would one day support the weight of civilizations. The silent guardians of Venice are whispering to modern engineers. As the city grapples with its slow descent into the lagoon, teams of scientists have been studying its wooden piles, not just to document their decay, but to understand their astonishing longevity. In a beautiful twist, their search for solutions has led them not forward but backward, to the very Roman and Byzantine techniques that first tamed this landscape. They discovered that the ancient principle of driving piles deep through unstable layers to reach a firm bearing stratum was not just correct, it was elegantly optimal. Today, the materials have changed from oak and larch to reinforced concrete and steel, but the fundamental geotechnical logic remains identical. This is a form of learned heritage where ancient empirical knowledge, proven over millennia, validates and inspires contemporary engineering. It is a powerful reminder that innovation is not always about inventing something new, but sometimes about rediscovering a profound truth that was understood long ago. This dialogue with the past extends beyond construction principles into the very science of materials. The study of ancient waterlogged wood is a treasure trove for modern composite material science. Researchers are fascinated by how these timbers, through natural processes like mineralization and the infusion of natural resins, became composite materials in their own right. They analyze the cell structure of 2,000-year-old oak that has resisted collapse, seeking to replicate its resilience in modern bio-based composites. Could we engineer a building panel today that mimics the tannin-rich heartwood of an ancient tree, creating durable materials from sustainable sources. The ancient builders were masters of using biology's own defenses, and their material choices are now a blueprint for developing new, durable substances that work in harmony with the environment rather than against it. Furthermore, the urgent race to save archaeological wood from crumbling upon excavation has driven significant advances in conservation chemistry. The development of treatments like polyethylene glycol soaking and sophisticated freeze-drying techniques were pioneered to stabilize these precious finds. But the knowledge gained has rippled outward. These same stabilization methods are now used in other fields, from preserving historic shipwrecks and water-damaged art to treating valuable wooden artifacts in museums worldwide. A challenge born from the mud of a Roman harbor has contributed to a global conservation toolkit, protecting cultural heritage far beyond its origin. This legacy invites a reflective and hopeful question. If the empirical wisdom of ancient port builders is still informing cutting-edge engineering and material science today, what other sustainable technologies have we lost to time? Their solutions emerged from a deep, attentive partnership with local environments, using locally sourced, renewable materials in brilliantly efficient ways. In an age seeking sustainability, we are realizing that some of the most elegant answers to our modern challenges may not lie in an uncertain future, but in a forgotten past waiting in the mud for us to look back and understand. The true measure of their genius is that their foundations still support not only stones but new ideas. Where the Rhine River once split into two great branches, a forest of oak rose from the water to build an empire of trade. This was Dorestad, the bustling heart of the early Frankish world, a sprawling emporium where silver, wine, and wool changed hands under the watchful eyes of Charlemagne's officials. Its port was not a sheltered harbor, but a muscular, linear assertion of control over the river itself. For hundreds of meters along the dynamic riverbank, builders constructed a continuous wooden wharf, a frontier of commerce hammered directly into the shifting earth. The design was straightforward yet immensely strong. Vertical oak piles were driven deep into the riverbed, and between them, horizontal oak planks were fitted to create a solid, resilient facing. This created a seamless waterfront where ships of all sizes could tie up, unload their wares from distant shores, and take on cargo from the Frankish hinterlands. The scale was industrial, a deliberate infrastructure project meant to channel the wealth of the North Sea trade directly into the coffers of a rising empire. But to walk that wharf in its heyday would have been to experience a symphony of hard use. Every plank, every pile bore the physical marks of relentless commerce. Archaeologists examining the timbers discovered deep, smooth grooves carved into the horizontal beams, precisely at the height where ship ropes would have been tied and tightened day after day, year after year. The wood itself was scarred by this constant friction, a testament to the unending cycle of arrival and departure. More tellingly, they found clear evidence of pragmatic, ongoing repair. Sections of planking were replaced not once, but multiple times, with newer timbers scarfed onto older ones. This was not a monument built for eternity in stone, but a workhorse built for constant operation in oak, maintained with a practical understanding that the port's value was in its ceaseless function. This very intensity of use became the key to its preservation. The Rhine at Dorestad was a living, meandering force. Over time, the main channel of the river gradually shifted its course away from the bustling waterfront. As the active port area was abandoned, the old, silent wharf was no longer scoured by currents or the wake of ships. Instead, the river began to lay down a gentle, steady blanket of silt over the forgotten timbers. This gradual burial was not a catastrophic event, but a slow, natural entombment. Layer by layer, the river sealed its own history in an anaerobic vault, protecting the wooden bones of its most prosperous age. The true gift of Dorestad's submerged forest is its voice in time. Dendrochronologists, those scientists who read the stories in tree rings, have performed a remarkable feat with these oaken piles. By matching the unique pattern of wide and narrow rings in each timber to a master chronology of European oak, they can pinpoint the exact year and often even the season when each tree was felled. This data has constructed a precise chronology of the port's life. They can see distinct phases of construction, massive expansions of the wharf that correlate perfectly with periods of Frankish political consolidation and economic boom under Charlemagne's rule. A new cluster of piles, all dated to the same year, tells of a deliberate imperial project, an investment in infrastructure to fuel growth. The wood tells a story of ambition, not just of commerce. Dorestad's foundations offer something rare, a physical timeline where imperial policy and economic history are literally nailed together in oak. The rise and fall of the port, reflected in the intensity of repair and then the silence of abandonment, mirrors the rhythms of the empire it served. Its wooden skeleton is more than a relic, it is a calendar of ambition, showing us how the pulse of trade was measured in the growth rings of trees and the steady, silent work of a river writing its own past in mud. Atlantis is more than a story, it is a cultural echo. The legend of a glorious city that vanished beneath the waves in a single day resonates across continents and centuries, from Plato's dialogues to the Celtic tales of wise. These myths feel too specific, too visceral to be pure invention. Scholars now wonder if they are folk memories, a kind of collective dreamwork, processing real events of catastrophic loss. Imagine a coastal community watching over generations as the sea slowly reclaims their harbor, or witnessing a sudden, violent subsidence during a seismic event. The physical city disappears, but its story does not. It is simplified, magnified, and passed down, transforming a complex geological process into a powerful narrative of divine punishment or tragic fate. The discovery of places like Heracleion, a real city that sank exactly as the legends describe, blurs the line between myth and history. It suggests that the tales we dismiss as fantasy may be the long shadow of actual, witnessed events, a truth preserved not in stone but in story. This connection deepens when we consider the material itself. For later generations stumbling upon evidence of these drowned cities, the survival of their wooden bones would have seemed nothing short of miraculous. To a medieval fisherman whose nets snagged on a submerged timber, or a farmer plowing a field who uncovered a blackened, waterlogged post far from any modern shore, what explanation could there be? Wood was known to rot, to crumble to dust within a human lifetime. Finding it intact after centuries, hard as iron and dark as night, defied everyday logic. This tangible mystery, pulled from the mud, could easily fuel local folklore. A city that refused to decay might be seen as cursed by the gods, its foundations preserved as an eternal warning. Or perhaps it was blessed, its sanctity protecting it from the ravages of time. The physical endurance of the wood lent a strange credibility to the old stories, providing a mysterious artifact around which new legends could crystallize. So we are left with a reflective question about human memory itself. How does a culture process a slow-motion disaster or an abandoned technological marvel? The answer seems to be through narrative. The intricate, real world causes sediment compaction, rising sea levels, seismic liquefaction, are compressed into a single, dramatic moment. The anonymous, ingenious engineers become a proud king or a foolish princess. The environmental pressures become the wrath of a forgotten deity. This transformation is not a failure of memory, but its mechanism. It is how we make sense of events that operate on timescales longer than our own lives, turning geological and archaeological facts into myths that carry moral lessons, explain the landscape, and satisfy a deep need for meaning. Therefore, the legacy of these ancient wooden foundations is twofold. They survive physically in their anaerobic tombs, and they survive culturally in our imagination. Every time the story of Atlantis is retold, or a local ghost story mentions the old city beneath the lake, the echo of those real ports, with their silent forests of oak and pine, reverberates. Their most enduring preservation may not be in the chemistry of the mud, but in the human compulsion to wonder, to explain, and to remember. They achieved a kind of immortality, not just as engineering, but as myth, ensuring that even when their physical timbers are someday gone, their sunken silhouette will remain etched in the stories we tell about our world and its hidden, watery past. The towering cedars of the Pacific Northwest hold a different kind of wisdom, one not of imperial commerce but of profound, sustained reciprocity. Here, indigenous peoples like the Tlingit and Haida engineered their relationship with the water not through conquest, but through an intimate partnership, using the forest itself to build a maritime world that was both functional and sacred. Their waterfronts were not separate from the community. They were its living room, its pantry, and its ceremonial heart, all supported by the most versatile material their world offered, the Western red cedar. This tradition showcases the same core principle we have traced globally, building a stable life upon wood near water, but it emerges from a fundamentally different philosophy, one of cyclical renewal rather than permanent dominion. The scale of their wooden engineering was breathtaking. Imagine a tidal flat transformed by a labyrinthine fence woven from stout cedar posts and woven branches, a fish weir designed to corral salmon on their seasonal runs with effortless efficiency. These were not simple barriers, but complex, strategically placed traps that worked with the rhythms of the tides and the instincts of the fish, requiring a deep, generational understanding of hydrology and animal behavior. Nearby, massive cedar logs, some over 60 feet long, were skillfully hollowed with fire and adds to become ocean-going canoes, vessels that were themselves floating extensions of the forest. And where the land met the sea, they built foundational platforms using pilings and layered logs to create stable terraces for their monumental longhouses. These great plank houses, often over 100 feet long, stood with their backs to the forest and their faces to the water, their very frames carved from the same cedar that surrounded them. The wood was not just a construction material, it was a relative. The builders possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of cedar's properties, knowing which trees, based on their location and growth pattern, would yield perfect planks for bending or resilient, straight grain for a sturdy piling. They harvested with ceremony and intention, understanding that the vitality of the forest was inseparable from the vitality of the people. This relationship was inherently sustainable, a model of use that ensured the resource would endure for generations. Unlike the stone monuments of other cultures, these wooden structures were part of a continuous cycle of maintenance, repair, and replacement. A longhouse was not built to stand untouched for 1,000 years. It was built to shelter a lineage, to be renewed and reclad as needed, its essence perpetuated even as individual planks returned to the earth. This is why we do not find these waterfronts preserved in anaerobic mud for millennia in the same way as a Roman harbor. The climate, the use patterns, and the cultural approach to materials were different. The legacy here is not in a single, timeless artifact pulled from the mud, but in a living tradition and the archaeological footprint of posts and platforms that speak to a way of life sustained over countless generations. It represents a parallel, profound branch on the same great tree of human ingenuity. It proves that the drive to build with wood upon the water is a near-universal adaptation, a solution born from deep listening to a specific place. Whether to channel the wealth of empires or to harvest the bounty of a salmon run, humanity has repeatedly looked to the forest and the shore, weaving them together with timber to create a foundation for life, in a stunning variety of forms, all answering the same fundamental human need. A diver's light cuts through the dark water, illuminating not just silt and fish, but a row of ancient wooden posts and the scattered gleam of gold coins. In that moment, two very different futures for this site hang in the balance. Is this a treasure trove to be claimed, or a fragile chapter of human history to be studied? This is the modern dilemma now facing the world's sunken foundations, a clash of values that unfolds in courtrooms and on the seabed itself. The treasure hunter sees a shipwreck's cargo as lost property, a financial reward for the risk and cost of recovery. The archaeologist sees an irreplaceable time capsule, where a single coin's position next to a timber can reveal more about trade routes than a chest of them in a private collection. This fundamental tension asks who truly owns the past when it lies beneath international waters or within a nation's contested maritime borders. To navigate these murky depths, the global community established a guiding framework, the 2001 UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage. Its core principles are a direct response to the threat of commercial exploitation. It advocates for in situ preservation as the first option, meaning leaving a site untouched on the seabed whenever possible, as its natural environment has already proven to be the perfect conservator for millennia. It strongly discourages the commercial trade of recovered artifacts, aiming to prevent history from being auctioned off piece by piece. The convention frames these submerged sites not as salvage, but as cultural heritage belonging to all humanity, a legacy to be managed with care rather than claimed as prize. This perspective is passionately echoed by many coastal nations and descendant communities. For them, a sunken port or shipwreck is not an abandoned relic, it is ancestral patrimony, a physical link to their identity and sovereignty. The wooden piles are not mere construction materials, they are the footprints of their forebears, holding cultural and often spiritual significance that transcends any market value. Technology now propels this ethical debate into ever deeper and more accessible waters. Advanced sonar, remotely operated vehicles, and sophisticated diving equipment can locate and reach sites that were once inviolable graves. Our curiosity and capability have never been greater, which makes our responsibility more profound. The very act of recovery can be an act of destruction, as we have seen with wood that crumbles upon exposure to air. So we must ask a difficult, reflective question. As we gain the power to retrieve everything from the deep, do we also develop the wisdom to sometimes leave things be? The survival of these wooden foundations for thousands of years imposes a unique duty of care on our generation. We are the first who can find them with ease, and thus the first who must consciously choose how to treat them. This forces us to define their value not just in historical or monetary terms, but in ethical ones. Are we stewards or salvagers? The answer will determine whether these ancient, silent forests in the mud remain as intact archives for future generations to learn from, or become scattered curios in private collections, their deepest stories forever lost to the currents of commerce. Our maps of the ancient world are missing entire coastlines. For tens of thousands of years during the last great ice age, so much of the planet's water was locked in glaciers that sea levels were over 100 meters lower than they are today. Vast stretches of what are now continental shelves were dry, fertile land, crisscrossed by rivers and likely dotted with the settlements of our ancestors. When the ice melted and the seas rose, these landscapes and any ports or structures built upon them were swallowed by the advancing waters. This means the next great chapters in the story of ancient wooden foundations likely lie not in the shallow mud of known harbors, but in the silent darkness of the deep continental shelf, waiting for our technology and curiosity to find them. The quest is moving into a new high-tech phase, driven by tools that let us see through the deep ocean's perpetual night. Autonomous underwater vehicles, or a UVS, are robotic submarines that can roam the seabed for days, mapping the terrain with laser-like precision using multi-beam sonar. This technology creates three-dimensional, centimeter-accurate maps of the seafloor, revealing features that look startlingly artificial, like straight lines, geometric shapes, or the faint outlines of what could be buried structures. But how do you find wood in all that mud and rock from a distance? Scientists are developing sensors that can detect the subtle chemical signatures of ancient, decomposing organic material. Isotopic analysis of seabed cores can sometimes pinpoint areas where the chemistry has been altered by the long-term presence of waterlogged timber, guiding archaeologists to promising targets. The potential search areas are staggering in scale. The Persian Gulf was once a fertile river valley, the mythical Eden to some scholars, before it flooded around 8,000 years ago. Its submerged deltas could hold evidence of some of humanity's earliest experiments with maritime life. The Sunda Shelf, connecting modern-day Indonesia and Malaysia, was a vast plain that could have served as a bridge for ancient migrations, with settlements along its lost rivers. The coasts of India, Australia, and the Americas all have similar drowned landscapes, each a blank space on our historical map. The very depth of these sites presents a new set of mysteries and possibilities. In the cold, high-pressure environment of the deep shelf, far from wave action and sunlight, preservation could operate by different rules. The extreme pressure might slow bacterial processes even further. The chemistry of the sediments at those depths, often finer and more uniform, could create even more effective anaerobic seals. Wood buried rapidly under deep sea conditions might be in a state of near-perfect stasis, waiting in the dark. Of course, the challenges are immense. Working at depths of 50, 80, or 100 meters requires saturation, diving, or robotic manipulators, making excavation exponentially more difficult, expensive, and slow. The pressure to simply locate a site is immense before a single artifact can be recovered. Yet the reward would be revolutionary. Finding a deep water wooden structure, a wharf or a platform from a time when that spot was dry land, would do more than add another port to our list. It would redraw the maps of prehistoric human migration and trade. It would prove that our ancestors were capable mariners and builders much earlier than we currently believe, exploiting coastal resources and establishing networks across these now vanished plains. Each undiscovered foundation in the deep is a potential keystone for an entirely new understanding of our past. This suggests our story is far from complete. For every Heracleion we have found, there may be a dozen still hidden in the deep. The ancient dialogue between humanity and the water's edge, written in wood and mud, has more pages left to read, and we are only now developing the tools to turn them. The incredible endurance of these ports was not a single miracle, but a perfect storm of 5 distinct, interlocking pillars. Each one alone is impressive, but together they form a recipe for survival that spans millennia. The first pillar is intelligent material selection. It was never just wood, it was the right wood. Builders across time and space consistently chose species with inherent defenses. They selected oak for its tannin-rich heartwood, alder for its resistance to splitting when wet, and larch for its natural resins. This was not random lumber, it was a calculated deployment of biological armor, using trees that came pre-equipped to resist the very environment they were placed in. Pillar 2 is masterful construction technique. This is where human ingenuity meets the mud. The rhythmic pile driving, the precise joinery, the creation of log rafts and wooden grillages, all served a single purpose: to distribute immense weight over unstable ground. Techniques like the Roman cribwork or the Frisian fascine mats were not just about building up, but about building smart, creating flexible, forgiving skeletons that could settle and shift without shattering. These methods turned a collection of posts into a unified, resilient platform. The third pillar is the anaerobic environment, the silent, unseen guardian. This is the loophole in nature's rules of decay. By driving wood deep into water-saturated, fine-grained sediments, builders unknowingly created an oxygen-free tomb. The dense mud acts as a seal, preventing oxygen from reaching the timber and starving the fungi and bacteria that cause rot. This is why wood that would crumble in decades on land can enter a state of suspended animation for centuries beneath the harbor floor. Pillar 4 introduces fortuitous geochemical processes where chemistry itself becomes a preserver. In sites like London or Heracleion, the slow dance of sulfate-reducing bacteria and dissolved iron in the groundwater leads to mineralization. Microscopic crystals of iron sulfide form within the wood's cellular structure, gradually replacing organic material with stone. This pseudomorphic replacement creates a perfect mineral cast of the original timber, an armor of stone forged by time and chemistry. The fifth and final pillar is the role of macro-environmental change, the vast, impersonal forces that often sealed the deal. Rising sea levels, shifting river courses, seismic events, or rapid siltation from deforestation. These changes could bury a port with startling speed. What was a disaster for the inhabitants became a preservation event for the foundations. The very catastrophe that ended a city's life often plunged its wooden bones into that perfect anaerobic sanctuary, locking it away for future discovery. So we are left with a final, reflective question. Does this powerful combination of pillars represent a lost golden formula, a conscious engineering philosophy passed down through generations? Or is it simply a series of brilliant, localized adaptations and happy accidents, leveraged by observant builders who learn to work with their environment rather than against it? The evidence suggests it is both. There was deep, empirical wisdom in their choice of materials and methods, a technology refined by observation. Yet the long-term survival often depended on forces beyond their control. The slow work of geology and chemistry that turned their pragmatic solutions into eternal artifacts. This synthesis is not just a list, it is a model of resilience. It shows us that durability is rarely about one breakthrough, but about a cascade of smart choices and fortunate alignments, a partnership between human craft and the patient, transformative power of the earth itself. From the Roman piles beneath London to the Viking timbers of Hedeby, we have walked on hidden forests. These are not relics of failure, but monuments to a profound collaboration. For millennia, their wooden bones have whispered a secret, that true resilience is found not in rigid defiance, but in intelligent adaptation. The builders of these ports did not conquer the water, they learned its language. They chose materials that would grow stronger in the wet, designed structures that could sway and settle, and positioned their work so that the earth itself would become their guardian. Their legacy is a 5-part formula, a symphony of material science, clever engineering, and environmental partnership that turned a temporary support into a permanent foundation. This hidden chapter of human ingenuity challenges our modern assumptions. We often equate strength with stone and permanence with immobility. Yet these ancient ports, standing on flexible wooden legs, outlasted empires built of granite. They teach us that durability is not about resisting change, but about absorbing it, about building systems that can endure precisely because they can adapt. The silent, preserving power of the mud and the slow alchemy of minerals were not accidents the builders hoped for, but conditions their methods actively encouraged. They worked with the nature of wood and the chemistry of water to create a lasting equilibrium. As we face our own era of rising seas and environmental uncertainty, there is a deep wisdom waiting in these waterlogged timbers. Their story is a masterclass in sustainable material use, in sourcing locally, in designing for the long term, and in listening to the landscape. They remind us that the most elegant solutions are often those that partner with natural processes rather than seeking to overpower them. The greatest discoveries, after all, often lie just beneath the surface. If this journey through sunken history has captivated you, we would love to hear your thoughts. Which of these ancient ports, from the lost harbor of Theodosius to the living tradition of Bergen's Bergen, fascinated you the most? Share your reflections in the comments below. For more deep dives into the hidden mysteries of our past, be sure to subscribe. Thank you for watching.